This video is designed to give you an introduction to the next topic in Theme 2, Challenges to Religious Belief, and that is atheism. And the first thing that you need to know in relation to atheism is what atheism is and how it differs from agnosticism. So hopefully by the end of this video you should be able to do the following things. First of all, to describe different types of atheism and agnosticism. So there are several types of each with their own key terms that you need to be able to use. You should be able to explain the difference between atheism and agnosticism, and we'll look at the ideas of a few key thinkers in relation to that. We also want to consider the reasons for the rise of atheism. So what might be some reasons that are driving atheism, especially in Western Europe. And also we'll have to think about where we can make some synoptic links between this topic and some things that you have either already studied or which you will soon be studying. So first we'll start to look at what we mean by atheism. And of course, in a general sense, atheism refers to the lack of belief in God or gods. But we can, of course, introduce different types of atheism. And one interesting distinction was given by the philosopher Anthony Flew. So Flew identified two different forms of atheism in his book, The Presumption of Atheism. The first is positive or strong atheism. This is when someone firmly believes or asserts that no deities exist. Now, Flew did not think that this was a good form of atheism. He thought it presumed too much and made too bold of a claim that we couldn't possibly know for certain. So he also introduces negative or weak atheism. This is when someone doesn't believe in the existence of any deities, but doesn't necessarily explicitly state that there are none. He thought that to do so again would be some kind of overreach. In his book, The Presumption of Atheism, Flew argues that any discussions about the existence of God should always start from the presumption of negative atheism. This idea that we don't know if God exists, or we don't believe in God, but in theory we'd be willing to change our minds if we could come up with some kind of reasonable concept and reasonable evidence to do so. The reason that he thinks that we should always start from the presumption of atheism is because he thinks that the onus lies on the person making the claim about God to prove it. So it's based on this principle, the onus of proof lies on the man who affirms, not on the man who denies. It's similar, as you can imagine, to something like a court case where innocence is presumed, so a lack of any action. But if someone wants to say that you're guilty, the onus is on them to prove that you did the crime rather than you to prove that that's not the case. What Flew argues is that the theist must demonstrate two things. First of all, that any concept of God is coherent and logical. So we have to understand what we actually mean when we're talking about God. And once we've established a coherent and logical concept of God, it is then up to the theist to show that there is sufficient reason or evidence for believing that this concept of God exists in reality, is instantiated in some way. Now, what's interesting about Flew is that shortly before the end of his life, he did actually change his mind about atheism and theism. So he was once known as one of the most famous or notorious atheists, so had a reputation within philosophy for defending the atheist position. But shortly before the end of his life, he changed his mind and conceded that probably there was a God. Writing this book, There Is a God. However, what we need to be clear on is that Flew did not change his mind to become a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew. He did not believe in a personal God or the God of classical theism. Rather, he proposed some kind of intelligent designer or a deistic form of God, a kind of God that had set up the rules of the universe, the laws of nature, and then left it to its own device, unconcerned with the affairs of humans. So you can imagine it a little bit more like Aristotle's prime mover, in a sense. Now, interesting synoptic link here. What actually convinced Flew to decide that there was an intelligent designer, according to this book, was a form of the teleological argument that's sometimes called the fine-tuning argument. And this is very similar to the argument that we looked at with F.R. Tennant. The idea that if we look around the universe, it seems plainly adapted for life, and the kinds of things that the universe would need in order to sustain life are so specific and so interlinked that it couldn't possibly be a result of chance. It must be a result of design. We'll move on now to look at agnosticism. And again, in a general sense, when we talk about agnosticism, this is when a person doesn't know if God exists or not. The term itself was coined by Thomas Huxley, you can see here with his impressive facial hair, from Greek words meaning without knowledge. So it's this idea that, again, we don't know if God exists or not. But again, just like with atheism, we can introduce different types of agnosticism. And again, we can talk about both strong and weak agnosticism. So first of all, weak agnosticism is when a person doesn't know whether or not God exists, but thinks that it might be possible to know at some point in the future. So it's potentially true that there could be some evidence that would cause us to know whether or not God exists. This is contrasted with strong atheism, which is when a person thinks that it's impossible to know whether God exists or not. We'll never be able to know it. It goes beyond the scope of our possible investigations. At this point, then, we go on to discuss the difference between atheism and agnosticism. And again, if we talk about these in a general sense, we've already established that an atheist is a person who doesn't believe in any God or higher power, whereas an agnostic is a person that's not sure or thinks we can't know whether or not a God or a higher power exists. But of course, we need to look at how there might be overlap or similarities or differences between these different types of atheism and agnosticism. And one thing that people might initially think is that there seems to be quite a similarity between Flu's negative atheism, where we start with this presumption that God does not exist, but we might be willing to be convinced based on the evidence, and something like weak agnosticism, which says that we don't know whether or not God exists at the moment, but we're willing to change our minds if evidence comes about. Now, Flu argues that they're not the same at all, that there is a distinction between the presumption of negative atheism and the presumption of agnosticism. And the key difference that Flu points out is about the starting point of each of these types of people. So while the agnostic presumes that there is some kind of legitimate concept of God or coherent and logical concept whose existence can be considered, the negative atheist does not presume that to start with. The theist has to establish that there is such a coherent concept before the consideration of whether that thing exists or not can be considered. There are, however, some other thinkers that think there is more of a similarity between atheism and agnosticism. And one of those thinkers is Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher. So he argues that agnostics can often hold views that are very close to atheism. So, for example, if they think the existence of God is so improbable that it's not worth considering. So in this case, the agnostic, of course, doesn't go so far as to say that there is no God. They're still, open to the possibility, but it would be so improbable that for all practical purposes, they are an atheist. So we cannot demonstrate with any kind of clear proof that God does not exist. So in a technical sense, you would have to be agnostic. But in a practical sense, the question of whether or not God actually exists does not impact your life in any way. So for practical purposes, Russell argues that that person would essentially be an atheist. To illustrate this idea of practical atheism with the analogy of a teapot. And I'll just read this extract from one of his books. He says, I ought to call myself an agnostic, but for all practical purposes, I am an atheist. I do not think the existence of the Christian God any more probable than the existence of the gods of Olympus or Valhalla. To take another illustration, nobody can prove that there is not between the Earth and Mars a china teapot revolving in an elliptical orbit, but nobody thinks this sufficiently likely to be taken into account in practice. I think the Christian God just as unlikely. So the point that he's trying to make here is that there are many claims that we wouldn't be able to prove or disprove. And so in a technical sense, we would have to remain agnostic about them. It would be beyond our scope to prove them true or false. But for all practical purposes, most people would not say, well, I must suspend my judgment about the teapot until I can prove it either way. For practical purposes, we would just say, I just don't believe in said teapot. There's not sufficient evidence either way. So technically agnostic, but practically atheist. One further form of atheism that we can consider is called protest atheism. And this has some really good links to the problem of evil, so it's a nice synoptic link that we can make to topics that we have studied. When we talk about protest atheism, what we mean is the rejection of God on moral grounds, usually based on some kind of experience of evil and suffering. So rejection of the idea that if God exists, I don't want to believe in him because I cannot imagine that this being is a very nice being in any way. This is often brought up in light of things like the Holocaust. So many Holocaust survivors may have lost their faith, and it might be because they reject God on the grounds that if he has allowed this to happen to us, this tragedy, then how can I go on believing in the type of being that he would be? So some famous examples that we've looked at in lesson of this. First of all, the character of Ivan Karamazov from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. We looked at this as a challenge to Hicks' theodicy, soul-making theodicy. And Ivan Karamazov points out that even if suffering is the cost of entry into heaven, that one has to suffer to get there, he says that the cost of entry is too high, and he respectfully returns God his ticket. So it's this rejection of God on his grounds, that if this is what God has designed for us, I don't want any part of it. A similar example we looked at was Stephen Fry, when we looked at the video at the start of the Problem of Evil topic. And Stephen Fry talks about a number of examples of natural evil in the world, so bone cancer in children, the insect that eats the inside of the eyes of children. And Fry asks us to imagine that if God exists, what kind of a being would he? He says he'd be a monster or a maniac and would be deserving of no respect whatsoever. So that kind of approach is, again, this protest atheism. It's rejecting God on the grounds that evil and suffering in the world make him out to be a kind of being that we wouldn't want to worship and we wouldn't want to believe in. We finally come to some discussion for the rise of atheism. Now, this is not explicitly stated on the specification. However, it can be helpful when you're looking at some of the topics in the Christianity unit, particularly the idea of whether or not secularization is a big challenge to religious belief and whether or not the UK ought to still be considered a Christian country. So within sociology, there is a thesis known as the secularization thesis. And the short version of this is essentially that as societies modernize, as they become more modern, they will inevitably become less religious. And this was a very popular theory from the late 19th century into the middle half of the 20th century. So it's a generally accepted thesis. There are still some scholars that accept this, although it's lost some favour for reasons we will see in a moment. So what that means in terms of societies becoming more secular is that we see a number of trends related to religion. So first of all, religion becomes marginalized from public life. Now that, of course, does not necessarily mean that people are becoming atheists. It just means that religion is less important in terms of how society organizes, especially at a kind of political level in some way. But what we also see alongside secularization is that fewer people are engaging in religious practices. So if we think about church attendance, that is massively declining, has been continuing to decline across the 20th century. But again, people could argue you can still believe in God, believe in religious tenets, but not go to church, and certainly that's what Grace Davey argues. But of course, when we look at surveys associated with religious belief, we're also seeing generally a trend of decline, at least in the UK. Now, the explanations usually given for this are various. So within the traditional secularization thesis, the typical explanations are, first of all, the idea of rationalization. So there's something about modern workplaces and the bureaucracy of it that increases rationalization, and this undermines religion in some way. Another reason that's often put forward is the increase of science and technology. Now, what I need to emphasize here is that when sociologists put forward science and technology as a reason for secularization, for the decline of religion, what they're not saying is that suddenly now everybody has a better understanding of scientific theories and they see that these clash or undermine religious scriptures. That might be part of it, but the more important aspect is that science and technology has given us much more control over our lives and the kind of societies we live in. And so what we do is we rely less on religion for a number of many and everyday things. If you think about in the past, if you were worried about drought, you might pray to God. If you were worried about sickness, you might pray to God, perform a religious ritual. Now you would dig an irrigation trench, get some fertilizer, and if you're sick, you go to the doctor. Very few people, for example, today would pray instead of going to the doctor. So what science and technology has done is it's reduced the scope for religion to play a part in our lives, and so people give it less importance. And finally, religious pluralism is often given as an explanation. So the sociologist Peter Berger argued that before modernity, people existed in what he called a sacred canopy. So there was one overarching view of the world, which was quite, harshly enforced by the Catholic Church, and people all kind of believed the same things. However, after the Protestant Reformation and increased religious pluralism, people's worldviews became questioned. Once you question that worldview, you come into contact with different views. It undermines the certainty with which you hold your own, to the point that all religious positions are essentially undermined and people move away from religion. So these are all possible explanations for rising atheism. We look at some statistics here from the UK, well, England and Wales census data. What we'll see is the rise of the people with no religion. So you can see just in 10 years, so from 2011 to 2021, the number of people reporting having no religion has grown quite significantly. And the largest proportion of people with no religion are younger. So we can imagine that that is going to keep continuing. There'll be more and more people that report having no religion as time goes on. Finally, what I should mention is that the secularization thesis has, at least over the last 50 years, been challenged. And there's a number of phenomena that sociologists would point to that challenge the idea that societies will inevitably move away from religion and become more atheistic. So some of those things are, first of all, the rise of global fundamentalism. So if we look at fundamentalist Christianity, particularly in the USA, and also the rise of fundamentalist Islam in the Middle East and Asia. The spread of Pentecostal Christianity, so that is doing incredibly well in many areas of the world, even those that are highly modernized, like South Korea. The emergence of religiously motivated political movements. So you can think about the Iranian Revolution. You can think about the Hindu nationalist movement in India, keeps winning elections. For example, you can think about the rise of Islamic and Islamist jihad movements. All of these are examples. And also the rise of new religious movements. So from sort of the middle of the 20th century onwards, and the rise of things like the New Age movement. These are not massively, they're not huge movements, but they still are an example of a trend against the turn towards atheism. And so what that has led some sociologists to argue is that the secularization thesis, this idea that societies as they modernize will move away from religion and towards atheism, might actually only apply in Western Europe. That might be the exception to the rest of the world.